Have you ever wondered how the modern world first tried to literally outlaw war entirely? Well, let's dive into this explainer detailing the fascinating origins, the brief triumphs, and unfortunately, the ultimate collapse of our very first massive global peace experiment. Just imagine a world freshly shattered by unprecedented global conflict, desperately searching for a way to ensure it never, ever happens again. That's the stage for the League of Nations.
To really wrap our heads around this pivotal era, we're going to follow a pretty clear path today. First, the dream of peace. Second, the anatomy of the League. Third, its early peacemaking successes. And finally, the League's fatal flaws.
Okay, let's kick things off with Section 1, the dream of peace, establishing a global association.
So, following the absolute devastation of the First World War, the world was practically in ruins. Leaders everywhere knew the old way of secret treaties and unchecked empires just had to end. And the absolutely crucial number to remember here is 14. That represents U.S. President Woodrow Wilson's famous 14 points. It was essentially his brainchild to create a world organization to maintain peace, and these 14 points served as the philosophical bedrock that birthed the whole idea of this new global association.
Wilson envisioned a highly transparent world. He explicitly called for the abolition of secret diplomacy, so no more backroom deals that suddenly plunge nations into war. He also advocated for free navigation at sea, the removal of economic barriers between states, and a massive all-around reduction in global armaments. He even pushed for specific geopolitical changes, like creating an independent Poland with secure access to the sea. But most importantly, he pushed for that final point, a general association of nations designed to preserve peace.
But, right from the very start, there was a massive underlying tension. On one hand, you've got the broad aims of the League, preventing wars through peaceful settlement and promoting international cooperation. Sounds great, right? But on the other hand, member nations had their own specific, sometimes selfish agendas. Take Britain's aims, for example. Alongside defending democracy and restoring Belgium and Serbia, they explicitly wanted to right the injustices done to France back in 1871, specifically the loss of Alsace and Lorraine to Germany. So you can immediately see how these high-minded global ideals were forced to share the stage with very specific, historically rooted national grievances.
Moving right along to Section 2, Anatomy of the League, Structuring World Peace.
So how was this grand idea actually put into practice? Well, established in 1920 with its headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland, the League operated through 5 main organs. Think of it kind of like a global government structure. First, the Assembly acted as an international legislature where every member state had a single vote. But get this, decisions actually had to be unanimous. Then you had the Council. That was the executive body, originally with 4 permanent and 4 elected members. Germany, by the way, would later grab a permanent seat there in 1926. The Secretariat in Geneva handled the day-to-day administration. For legal disputes, they established the Permanent Court of International Justice over in The Hague with 15 judges. And finally, they attached the International Labor Organization, or ILO, aiming to improve working conditions all across the globe.
Now, in addition to those 5 organs, they created what was known as the mandate system. See, after the war, territories captured from the Central Powers in Turkey weren't just simply given back. Instead, the administration of these countries was distributed among various victorious powers, and the League of Nations was tasked with supervising them. It was a pretty massive expansion of international oversight.
All right, Section 3, Early Peacemaking Successes, Arbitration in Action.
This wasn't all just theory. For a time, the League actually worked. Throughout the 1920s, they successfully stepped in to mediate and resolve some really intense, rapid-fire border disputes. In 1920, they settled a major argument over the ownership of the Åland Islands between Sweden and Finland, ultimately deciding in favor of Finland. In 1921, they helped navigate a tricky nationality dispute between Great Britain and France over in Tunis and Morocco. Then, in 1923, after an Italian general was murdered on Greek soil and Italy occupied the island of Corfu, the League, with some British and French mediation, managed to bring about a compromise. And in 1925, when a Greek army commander was murdered and Greek forces actually marched into Bulgaria, the League investigated, ordered a withdrawal, and even made Greece pay compensation. They were actually out there stopping wars. They even managed incredibly complex economic and territorial disputes, like the Mosul boundary dispute. Basically, both Turkey and Great Britain's mandated territory of Iraq claimed the Mosul region, which happened to be rich in oil. A pretty high-stakes situation, right? Well, the League stepped in and mediated, leading to a 1926 treaty where a small part of the territory went to Turkey, along with a cut of the royalties from those oil fields. It was a successful, peaceful compromise over a highly valuable resource. And beyond the borders and political standoffs, the League quietly secured massive, non-political victories that legitimately improved everyday lives. They set up a slavery convention in 1925, which led to a permanent slavery commission. Their financial commission supervised essential international loans for struggling countries like Austria and Hungary. Plus, in 1923, they established a health organization that actively fought global diseases like malaria, smallpox, and tuberculosis. Believe it or not, they even worked on controlling the dangerous drug trade and suppressing the international trade of obscene literature. They really were tackling the whole shebang.
So, with all these noble ideals, a robust organizational structure, and legitimate early victories under its belt, we really have to ask, why did it all fall apart? How do we go from peacefully settling border disputes to a devastating Second World War?
That brings us to Section 4, the League's fatal flaws, the road to war.
The failure of the League wasn't due to just one single catastrophic event. Instead, it was a compounding series of structural flaws, unchecked political realities, and growing resentment. First and foremost, the foundation was compromised right off the bat by a glaring historical irony. Despite being founded on the ideas of U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, major world powers like the United States and the USSR were never members. Without the military and economic backing of those heavyweights, the League's actual authority was severely handicapped from day one.
Furthermore, the Covenant of the League of Nations was made part and parcel of the World War I peace settlement. It was inextricably tied to the Treaty of Versailles, and this was a massive problem because many nations viewed Versailles strictly as a treaty of revenge. Because they absolutely refused to ratify a treaty they saw as deeply unfair, they were essentially barred from joining or fully participating in the League.
This Treaty of Versailles created a cascading disaster. It's like watching dominoes fall. First, the victorious countries humiliated Germany, and France insisted on forcing heavy war reparations right in the middle of severe economic difficulties. This immense financial pressure contributed directly to the downfall of Germany's democratic Weimar Republic, and sadly, those exact conditions paved the way for the rise of Nazi dictatorship and Adolf Hitler, who preached pseudo-patriotism and racial superiority. Ultimately, Germany began blatantly defying the Treaty of Versailles, increasing its armaments, and when the League questioned this, Germany simply walked away and left the organization altogether.
As economic hardships spread around the globe, aggressive dictatorships rose in power, and the League found itself entirely paralyzed. When Japan conquered Manchuria in the Far East, the League wasn't in a position to properly condemn the action, so Japan just left. When Italy's fascist dictatorship, fueled by narrow nationalism, captured Abyssinia, the League questioned it, and Italy left too. Germany expanded its sway over Austria and Poland, completely defying its treaties. You see, the whole system relied on cooperation, and when faced with aggressive nations who were perfectly willing to simply walk away, the League literally had no mechanism to stop them.
Consequently, a really dark feeling took hold. It seemed the League was merely a tool dominated by the victorious World War I countries, especially France and England. Smaller nations completely lost faith. They realized that when push came to shove, this grand global association had absolutely no real power to control the aggressive, territorial activities of the big powers. The whole safety net, it was just an illusion.
Ultimately, the member states refused to cooperate, the League failed in its core mission, and the world plunged back into the nightmare of total war in 1939. The League of Nations was officially dead. Yet, from its ashes, and more importantly, from its distinct failures, the United Nations organization was eventually established. So, as we wrap up this explainer and reflect on this incredible piece of history, we have to ask ourselves, without the bitter, painful lessons learned from the League's collapse, would the modern United Nations and the relative global stability we know today even exist?